So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I'm Betsy Gilliland, the current chair of the TESOL Second Language Writing Interest Section. I'm really excited about today's session, which is actually in collaboration with our sister organization, the Second Language Writing Standing Group of the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Which, if you're not aware of, we are essentially doing the same thing in two different groups. We're the TESOL people who are interested in writing. They're the writing people who are interested in second language writers. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Eunjung Lee, who's the co-chair of the SEA's Second Language Writing Standing Group.
Thank you, Betsy. Hi, everyone. My name is Eunjung Lee, as Betsy introduced nicely. I am an assistant professor at Queen's College, currently co-chair of the Second Language Writing Standing Group at SEAS. To give you a little bit of background, this workshop was presented at SEAS this year in March, and we're excited to do another rendition through a TESOL webinar. So thank you so much for this opportunity. To begin, I would like to introduce very briefly our presenters today. Today's presenters include Nora Fahim, Stanford University, Jennifer Torres Johnson, also Stanford University, Missy Watson from City College of New York, CUNY, Rachel Shapiro, Rowan University, Jennifer Slinkard, University of Arizona, Jaron Gevers, University of Arizona, and Greer Murphy, University of Rochester. Facilitators originally were both Brooke Schreiber from Baruch College and myself. Brooke also was a co-chair last year, and today I'll be the facilitator for the workshop. So without any further ado, let's begin. Nora and Jennifer.
Hello, my name is Nora Fahim. I am the Associate Director at the Hume Center for Writing and Speaking at Stanford University. I also teach in a program in writing and rhetoric. And Jennifer, my wonderful co-worker and partner, is also here with us. Jennifer?
Hi, my name is Jennifer Johnson, and I'm a lecturer in the program in writing and rhetoric at Stanford, and my background is applied linguistics and education.
So our topic today stems out of research we've done here on campus, and we were very keen to learn more about the experiences of our multilingual students. And with that comes our title, Complicating Multilingual Writer Identities Within and Beyond Institutional Contexts. And as you will see, we were keen to learn about the classroom-based experiences, but very much about some of the experiences that they had prior to coming into campus. And I apologize, but the Stanford band is playing right outside my office right now. So I'll close the window. All right, I hope that's better.
Can I just ask also, we see Dominic Tracy's screen right now. Dominic, if you could please close that so that we can see the slides for the webinar. Eunjung, you may have to reshare your slides.
Okay, let me, sorry. I don't think I got the invitation to share my screen. Okay, there you go.
All right.
There it is.
What we're going to share with you today is a workshop activity which we did an extended version of during the first season workshop. And we'll be happy to share the prompts in the resource pool that we're offering everyone later. So we'll give you a sneak peek into that so that we can investigate some of the instructor perspectives that help us complicate multilingual writer identities. And then we will share specific, really wonderful quotes that our research participants generously shared with us about their experiences and different interpretations. So to get us started, we'll look at our next slide. So just to give us a little context, here's some literature that really grounds a lot of what we've come across. CCCC reminds us that recent second language writing research points to a divide between the rhetoric that surrounds the internationalization of higher education, that yay moment, and the reality of multilingual students' academic experiences in our classrooms, or what we hear about their classrooms and writing centers. And then Christine Tardy reminds us that these students may include immigrants, children of immigrants, refugees, expatriates, and these numbers are largely unaccounted for because they are domestic students. So if you check your university demographics, they will definitely have the number of international students, but there are definitely many more multilingual students that perhaps in some cases choose to not be identified. So our next point is really this instructor perspectives workshop activity. So I'll share with you what we did there. What we were aiming to get at is that some assumptions, and we use that word deliberately, are institutionally based from the wider institution. And then some are definitely instructor based, whether in our classrooms or what our students tell us about other perceptions from other instructors. And then what was really interesting in our research is that multilingual students amongst themselves have assumptions about each other, especially in cases where some are international and some are local and domestic. So with that, we'll share with you our first prompt. Consider different perceptions, and we're very keen on the word perceptions here, about the multilingual student population in your institutional context. So we'll go ahead and listen to a few prompts. And as I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and share those prompts after the session is over. So the first one is, consider your institution. Think about the different ways multilingual students are perceived and labeled. Specific terms by your larger institution. This can be through print, web sources, events, multicultural events and whatnot, writing centers, or through larger campus entities. Like what labels and titles are used to refer to this specific population? What demographics are noticed or visible? We found that international students in our institution, at least, are generally more highlighted. What demographics are invisible? So in that, you could do definitely this session with your own cohort, with your own program, and where you jot down some of these observations. So that's the first level. So we'll move to the next level, which is teacher-based perceptions, where we can consider the faculty and teachers in your institutional context. Think about the different ways multilingual students are perceived and labeled, again, by using specific terms by these instructors across campus. Now, it's always very interesting to talk with instructors from other departments, not just your own. I'm sure we all have experiences there. These perceptions can include conversations you've had with faculty. You may also learn of some of these perceptions from multilingual students themselves. I see a lot of this in the writing center, where a student will come with a paper and, the unfortunate situation where she's been told to come to fix her English first before she submits the final draft. And then the next level of perceptions we're going to look at is the student-based perceptions. Consider conversations you've had with your own students, whether in class, office hours, conferences, writing center. You may also learn about some of these perceptions from multilingual students themselves who share conversations they've had or feedback they've received from other students, whether they be local or international. So these are the 3 prompts we're sharing with you. And what we encourage you to do is that this would yield a really informative discussion within your department about some of these perceptions. Some of them are definitely, in some ways, assumptions, and kind of try and contest or question them, but also, do consider having some of these discussions with faculty or administrators that go beyond your departments. So our next point is that we want to share with you some of the student perspectives that we came across through our narrative study. We had a series of one-on-one interviews with students who self-selected to participate in our study. The only requirement was that they be multilingual, and we left that interpretation open to them. So our next point is these will may be familiar to some of you, but we were really keen on narrative-based inquiry because these are stories lived and told by our students. We get to learn knowledge from the bottom up. We may sit all day and like hypothesize what's best for our students, but we need to remind ourselves to stop and pause and go back to the students and learn about their experiences and needs and expectations. This is a summary of the findings we came across, so I'll just give you a quick overview. And as you can see, these stem from institutional assumptions and perceptions, teachers' assumptions, and student assumptions. So what we found is that there is an important need to nuance MLL's understanding of their societal identities and labels, how they're perceived. Also spending more time understanding the diversity of their educational backgrounds. We were fascinated by their community-based responsibilities and how institutional settings don't really encompass that. It was definitely post-Trump era, so there's a lot to be said about the socio-political implications. And this really led us to think more deliberately about how we can support our MLL students. So we'll go ahead and share some of the data here. So the first one regards complicating identities, and we're just listing here. We have a few more labels to share with you, but these are some of the common labels used to refer to multilingual students. So if we go ahead and click next, we'll find that students themselves don't actually have a consensus on what label they use to refer to themselves or to other students. So leading on to our next point is that it's definitely more nuanced. So let's go ahead and look at some of the student quotes we have for today. So the first one relates to the label ESL. We asked students, okay, when you hear the word English as a second language, what comes to mind? So these two quotes are actually by local students, and as you can see, they have quite different interpretations. The first student says, I think illiterate. It was definitely two ways. I got bullied in school for not being able to speak English. You know, ESL is equivalent to special ed. But then we had another local student who had arrived to the US much earlier than the first one, and she thought the term was helpful because in some ways schools can pay more attention and give resources to students, and she did not think it was a negative term. The next term we have is multilingual, which is now more commonly used in scholarship. Our first student who was local, it's very interesting. She said, but mostly I think about people who grew up in Europe who have a lot of different languages themselves, you know, kind of from an international European perspective. That's what she was thinking. Then we had an international student say that it gave her a feeling of being proud. But then she noted, oh, but it's multilingual learner. You're still learning. Like in my first language, I'm still learning. So she was open to that. And then one international student, look at the shift that's happening here, noted that this is mostly based on like Latino students, because I guess that's the biggest focus of multilingual discussions. And she didn't really include herself in that title. The next term we have is international. So here we have international student quotes. The first student said, I really like being defined as international. I feel proud. I say, yeah, like I have a different experience than everyone else, and that's something that makes me unique. I'm international, and I like it. So really positive. The second quote talked about having a sense of unity with other international students because we had similar struggles and experiences, and everything is so different from us. So you can see the international students here are using the term international as a form of community building. But from the previous quotes we came across, we can see that local and multilingual students and international students amongst themselves are doing some sort of othering, even amongst themselves. So moving on, we have this last quote here that pivots to a negative interpretation of international. Sorry, Injung, there we go. So this one's quite different. I feel not valued because international students are a minority here. But this institution takes for granted that you know how things work, that you know your way around, you know how to say things, like random small things that people take for granted. She talked about icebreakers, and she was like, what's an icebreaker? I only found out on like the second day of class, and it's not normal for her. So again, you know, students have very different experiences and interpretations. So moving on, here are some things we really need to think about, especially now that we've come across some of the students' words, that in our classrooms, we need to introduce culturally relevant pedagogy. in terms of classroom management practices, should we, create some kind of consensus and have students participate in that? Definitely. And as always, bring in inclusive content. One student who was taking anthropology also perceived it to be from a very American perspective, and it didn't encompass that international lens she wanted to bring in. We should definitely, based on that, bring student experience in the classroom. They all talked about needing a little more time with their assignments. They'll get there, they want to get there, but I can't, the deadline is definitely way too fast for me. And then being very diligent, making students aware of campus resources. And we can definitely talk about that more later. So last words here are, next slide, please. That we'll share with you our prompts, but as the rest of our speakers today share with you their presentations, we'll have time for questions, so please do write them down, and we'll do our best to get them back to you. So thank you from me and Jennifer.
Hi, and thanks to Nora and Jennifer. Welcome everybody. I'm Rachel Shapiro from Rowan University, where I teach a range of courses across first-year writing, the Writing and Literacy Studies majors, and our MA program.
And hi everyone, my name is Missy Watson. I'm assistant professor at City College of New York, part of the CUNY system, where I teach undergraduate composition, as well as graduate courses in the MA program in language and literacy.
Our talk today is focused on the concept of monolingualism and the importance of actively contesting monolingualist ideologies in our teaching. Monolingualism is an ideological paradigm, a set of socially constructed beliefs that restrict and actively work against difference in multifaceted ways, which we'll unpack further in a moment. Scholars like Suresh Kanagaraja, Rosina Lippi-Green, Minzan Liu, Paul Ki Matsuda, James and Leslie Milroy, Bruce Horner, Christine M. Tardy, and John Trimber have long acknowledged that monolingualist ideologies are harmful and have real psychological and material costs and consequences for linguistically diverse students. At its worst, monolingualism can lead, and historically has led, to a silencing and even eradication of languages and varieties, as well as brutal penalization of speakers of non-preferred languages. Monolingualist ideologies harm speakers' confidence, sense of identity, and family relations, as well as manifest in additional material consequences, such as increased tuition for international students, required non-credit-bearing remedial courses, the costs of language exams, the increased time, money, and labor required for seeking extra tutoring and support in writing centers, and other extra demands and burdens that they face.
So we believe that actively contesting monolingualism can be instrumental to achieving a more socially just and anti-racist approach to teaching writing. But to further complicate matters, there are at least 4 distinct strands of monolingualism. So in our 2018 Composition Forum article, clarifying the multiple dimensions of monolingualism, keeping our sights on language politics, we distinguish and describe these 4 strands. And we argue that we can account for these better in our research, and when we do account for all 4 in our research and teaching, we can seek more linguistically and racially just approaches. So here are the 4 strands we identify. The first strand is monolingualism as standard language ideology, which is the belief system that assumes there's just this one standard variety of language that is ideal, proper, and all around superior as compared to other languages and dialects, and thus that users should strive towards this one variety in school and beyond. But we of course have long understood that any notion of a standard language is a socially constructed myth. All languages are linguistically equal, and excluding or subordinating any one language is really an act of dominance and oppression. The second strand is monolingualism as tacit English-only policy. So this is a belief system based off assumptions that English is the only language, not just standard English variety, but English as a language that can or should be used in public communications. That inviting and honoring other varieties will cause this untenable confusion or mongrelized languages, or deter us from a more unified or patriotic monolingual potential. But we've long known that language variety is the norm rather than the exception, that many varieties can coexist across communities, and that patriotism is not dependent upon monolingualism.
For the third strand, monolingualism as the myth of linguistic homogeneity represents the belief systems that assume most given audiences in classrooms and across the US are native English speakers. This myth prevents us from re-envisioning how to communicate and how to better teach with a multilingual audience in mind. Since we've long recognized that our classrooms and nation are linguistically diverse, we're overdue in composition teaching to understand, tap into, and better support that diversity. And our final strand is monolingualism as the myth of linguistic uniformity, stability, and separateness. This is a myth that perceives languages as unchanging and distinct from one another. This myth suggests that languages are pure, fixed, and stagnant, that languages can be segregated, and that it is possible and even ideal to switch between distinct languages without slippage, mingling, or transformation. This view of language discounts the history of and continued mixing of language and culture through mobility and colonialism, and overlooks the fluid, emergent, and synergistic quality of languages as they interact and change. All monolingualist ideologies are harmful to all language users, as are the structures, practices, and policies that emerge from them.
And I think Robin Crowell in the chat box is right. I think there might be a participant with their microphone on. So if everyone can check their microphones and hit mute, that would help so much. So when we combat monolingualist ideologies in our composition classrooms, and we definitely believe we should, we must be mindful of whether we're overlooking any one strand. So consider what happens when we do not attend explicitly to that first monolingualism. Monolingualism, the standard language ideology, as integral to the ideologies we aim to combat. So for example, a scholar addressing just the final three monolingualist ideologies might focus her energies on these three intertwined objectives. She might invite and honor language difference in her classroom, really encouraging, code mesh texts that feature a fuller range of students' linguistic repertoires, among other practices, thus, working against monolingualism as tacit English-only policy. She might study and acknowledge the linguistic diversity in her classroom and work to train university faculty, including herself, to gain practical knowledge on how to better support linguistically diverse students, really working against monolingualism as the myth of linguistic homogeneity. She may also encourage students to engage their own and others' language varieties and communication practices as dynamic, fluid, synergistic, while also training faculty across the curriculum to understand and treat languages as such, working against monolingualism as the myth of linguistic uniformity, stability, and separateness. So while these stances, these last three practices are downright progressive, commendable, really worth celebrating, they take up only 3 of the 4 strands of monolingualism. So such a pedagogy really lends to celebrating diversity, celebrating the trans, the fluid nature of language, and it heightens awareness of linguistic diversity and language theory, for students and faculty alike. But it also misses the critical opportunity to acknowledge in our research, our teaching, and administration how language differences are tied up with language ideologies that hierarchize language varieties and their users. So, and as far as we're concerned, that is the most crucial aspect of combating monolingualism.
So in order to better attend to monolingualism as standard language ideology, we could interrogate with students the uses and harms of standardized English. And we could acknowledge that the notion that there is any language variety that is standard is in fact a myth. Students could come to know the racist roots and results of standardized English in the US. They might examine their own or their community's experiences with standardized English and the ways in which it has served and or harmed them. A more multidimensional approach to monolingualism, including and especially monolingualism as standard language ideology, will better centralize language politics and the material realities that follow in our composition scholarships and pedagogy.
So in the aforementioned article that Rachel and I wrote together, we conclude by suggesting a shared student learning outcome that we believe invites us to grapple with standard language ideology with students. So in classes, one outcome could be that students will recognize the role of language attitudes and standards in empowering, oppressing, and hierarchizing languages and their users. So that being a focus in a class, a goal for a composition course. And we recognize, of course, that advocating for such an outcome is not straightforward, and it's certainly not a comprehensive solution. Our current institutional locations, depending on what they are, as well as the politics and constraints of our differing positions within those contexts, will certainly shape, the outcomes and certainly lead us to develop them differently in our own complicated contexts. And we'll also need to assess, what resources, what tactics will best support this work and, in our departments and beyond.
Learning outcomes like this one are powerful in shaping shared values and shared practices that can unite our efforts against harmful language ideologies and practices. But if we honor and engage language diversity without confronting the often racist and colonizing politics underlying monolingualism, we risk opening the proverbial gate only to welcome linguistically diverse students into still hostile academic spaces.
So we want to conclude by just inviting all of us to consider how a multidimensional understanding of monolingualism may help us to generate learning outcomes and supporting pedagogical practices that work toward anti-racist linguistic justice in our own institution.
So, we ask, how might your understanding of monolingualist ideologies be more attentive to the various strands we've reviewed here? How might these strands be used as a framework to guide revision to your own pedagogies?
What sorts of assignments, lesson plans, and assessment practices do you already use that might work well to teach toward the outcome we suggest? Which new curricula and practices might you develop?
And finally, what might be your first step in working towards this new outcome in your local context? We look forward to hearing from you in the question and answer period.
Thank you.
Thank you, Missy and Rachel. A lot of food for thought. And my name is Jeroen Gevers, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Arizona, and I teach first-year writing as well.
And I'm Jenny Slinkard. I'm also at the University of Arizona, and I just defended my dissertation on language policy in a writing program. So I'm really excited to talk with you all today about our activities.
The title of our presentation is Engaging Students in Conversations about Multilingualism and Correctness. And our project is based on the idea that, as the previous speakers addressed just now, language ideologies reinforce stereotypes. They have lots of harmful effects. They can reinforce stereotypes. They can lead to negative self-perceptions and other perceptions. However, we also believe that it's important to keep in mind that language attitudes cannot be taught. Students first need to recognize how language ideologies are socially constructed before being in a position to critique or transform them. And so what we asked ourselves is how teachers can facilitate opportunities for students to wrestle with internalized ideologies and reflect on them. In response to that question, we have proposed 3 concrete pedagogical activities. Jenny will talk a little bit about the first activity, and then I'll talk about activity 2, and finally Jenny will again briefly talk about the third activity.
Okay, so the first activity we're presenting is an argument on language standards. This activity was first taught in a first-year writing course for multilingual students. And the rationale behind this was to encourage students to reflect on norms and standards in the teaching of English pronunciation or writing. So students are asked to write an argumentative essay in which they consider the appropriateness of standard or non-standard models like World Englishes in English as an additional language or writing classrooms. So in this way, they can reflect on norms and standards and build their critical awareness of standardness and native speakerism as ideologies, while they're considering alternative models for what might be used in class. So we envision this as a full unit culminating in this argument that students write about language standards. So it begins with assigning introductory texts on language variation or world Englishes, and then scaffolding the longer assignment through homework assignments, discussions, and reflections, and then finally having students choose from different assignment options. So they can write about whether they believe native speaker pronunciation should be taught as the model of in English courses. They can also choose to write about whether students should be taught dominant or non-dominant forms of English writing. And then alternatively, they can write a position paper specifically for their university's professors, talking about their own specific contexts. And we ask them to support their position using the course content as well as their personal experiences or goals that they might have as EAL writers.
The second activity is essentially an extended analysis of grading rubrics. And I myself have used this activity in first-year writing classes. The idea here is that assessment practices play a really important role in establishing and reproducing language norms and notions of correctness. And for that reason, we think they're a really good opportunity for both students and teachers to investigate their own and each other's expectations when it comes to language use. As you can see on the slide, this activity consists of two parts. In the first part, students work with grading rubrics that they have collected from writing assignments. That could be writing assignments from first-year writing courses, could also be content courses. And they focus on identifying criteria in those rubrics that pertain to form, pertain to language use. And then they are asked to essentially consider what kind of expectations are communicated by those criteria. In the second part, they reflect on the possible reasons that instructors might have to use those rubrics and include those particular criteria. And they also are asked to think about how criteria like those might help students or not to achieve their learning goals. They can also be asked to think more generally about how appropriate they think the criteria are for the course goals or outcomes. There are some possibilities for follow-up activities. Students could be asked to revise an existing rubric that they think doesn't work well, is not effective. And they could also propose a new rubric. They could even be asked to write a journal entry where they think about their own goals when it comes to language use and how assessment practices might support those.
Okay, and finally, our third activity was originally designed for an upper level undergraduate course in sociolinguistics. However, we think that this could be adapted to a writing classroom or to any other kind of classroom, depending on the level and goals of your students. So within this activity, students are asked to investigate language attitudes about English accents from within their own communities, as well as their own language attitudes about English accents, in order to note how notions of prestige or appropriateness are socially constructed and are not actually inherent in the language itself. So this activity encourages students to consider attitudes about English within their own communities, so they can they have a sense from their own friends and family, essentially. So the task in this assignment begins by having students read a couple of chapters from Rosina Lippi-Green's book, English with an Accent, just to give them an underlying idea about what language attitudes are. And then they are asked to listen to a range of accents from a couple of archives. There is the International Dialects of English Archive and the Speech Accent Archive are both freely available online. Then after listening to that, or while listening to it, They write a journal entry about how they feel about each accent, deciding which ones they think sounds good or which ones sound bad, kind of investigating their own assumptions about the speakers, and also considering where those speakers might be disadvantaged or advantaged depending on their speaking ability. And then students also choose several of those excerpts to play for friends and family, and ask them the same questions. And then they can consider whether they're surprised by anything people say, and compare what their respondents do have to say. Follow-up activities could be that students present their findings to the whole class. You can compare among students. You could also create a more detailed survey and expand the surveys to participants from students in different fields of study or with different language backgrounds.
Thank you. Yeah, so this slide, things to consider, some things that we thought might be good to keep in mind. Of course, we're aware that you may already be using pedagogical activities that are aimed at inviting students to examine their own language ideologies. And so it might be a good idea to think about how you could extend those activities. If you're interested in trying out some of the activities that we talked about, maybe think about how you could adapt those to your curriculum and integrate them. And of course, it's important to think of program standards and curricular goals more generally. Finally, we have already mentioned this several times, but as a more general thing to keep in mind, I think it's good to always invite reflection from students on their personal learning goals when it comes to language use.
Okay, and then, well, finally, we have included a list of references for further reading that we think would be helpful both to the instructors wanting to expand their own knowledge about these ideas, as well as possibly to share with their students as an assignment.
Hi, this is Eunjung again. I think somebody else also had a control over the slide, and I am not having any control over my own slide anymore.
Oh.
We see your screen, Eunjung, so I wonder if you just started again, and anyone who's on the shared Google Doc could, yeah, okay.
Are you able to see it again?
I can see the presentation slides now.
Okay.
Okay, so we just finished presenting this further reading list here, and of course we invite any questions about these activities, and we're happy to share them as outside of the Google Doc if you have any problems accessing them.
Thank you.
All right, so hi everybody. Thanks Jerome and Jennifer and everybody. This has been awesome to hear about your work. My name is Greer Murphy. I'm currently the Director of Academic Honesty at the University of Rochester. I have a background in faculty development, the teaching of first year writing, and I'm working with faculty across the curriculum in source-based writing pedagogy. So I'm happy to talk with you about these important topics today. You can go ahead, Eunjung. Great, so I'm going to start by discussing three broad types of academic honesty policy. These were borrowed from and developed with colleagues from Case Western Reserve University and my previous institution, Claremont Graduate University. So the first type of policy, legal judicial, is basically any policy whose primary focus is on giving a set of rules, guidelines, procedures, specific sanctions, basically due process protections to student and staff stakeholders. The second, community ethos, is a code of conduct often tied to school mission that affirms academic honesty and integrity as being central to an institution's identity and community, and something that's lived out ideally in the behaviors of all members of that community. And then finally, the third, contract or promise, is very similar to those previous types, with the addition that it asks students, a policy like this will ask students to make explicit signed promises that any work submitted is their own. If they're found to have committed academic dishonesty, for instance, plagiarized, they've now, in addition they have broken a signed agreement, and maybe, depending on the institution, subject to more severe penalty. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to keep those three elements in mind as we turn to talking about criteria for assessing academic honesty policy and process. Here I'm borrowing from the work of Diane Pecorari, whose excellent book, Teaching to Avoid Plagiarism, blends pedagogy with policy analysis and advocacy. So her first criterion for a good academic honesty policy and document generality reminds us that policies must be sufficiently broad to accommodate shared understanding, for instance, of faculty across different fields and disciplines. This is a blending of kind of the policy and the process aspects of academic honesty. Go ahead. Oh, thanks. Second criterion, specificity, makes the point that a policy should be narrow enough so that staff, faculty, and student stakeholders feel they know what it means and how to apply it in practice. And then finally, flexibility. For Pecorari, this is a specific reference to reporting and to the process of academic honesty violation. Means that a process needs to be sufficiently manageable and known to staff, faculty, and students so that anyone who follows it feels that the time and effort invested is valued, appreciated, and well spent. So what does this look like in practice? To see a little bit more about that, we're going to review two sample policies. And as you're looking at this first one, I'll tell you up front, hopefully you'll recognize that this comes primarily out of kind of the legal judicial tradition type of policy. So I'll give you a second or two to take a look. Let's go ahead and jump. So hopefully that brief glimpse revealed that this is a policy triangulating it against Pecorari's criteria that is general, not terribly specific. The bolded text from the previous slide involves the giving or receiving of unauthorized help, and that's about as detailed as the entire policy got. And then finally, it's a bit difficult to assess in terms of its flexibility. We're turning now to a different policy, our second academic honesty policy example, which takes more of a community ethos-based approach, although you might see some other elements too. There's an appeal to shared values, excellence in academic honesty as the cornerstone, and a bit of an explanation of what those values might look like in practice. Academic honesty means, et cetera, et cetera. So again, how might we triangulate this against Pecorari's three criteria of generality, specificity, or flexibility? So there, outside of what you saw in the policy, the excerpt that I shared with you, there's a pretty extensive list with definitions of various infractions and several examples of each. So it is broad. It does meet the generality criterion. It also meets the specificity. How well does it do on the third? So this is really kind of a trick question, as it's tough to tell from looking at any policy on paper just how flexible its processes are going to be in actual practice. And it's that trickiness that comes with flexibility that can be so confusing for students, particularly multilingual students. And thus, for those of us who advocate for multilingual students, it becomes really important to contend with this. So this is a really quick example of something that can be done to make a flexible, tricky process a little bit more transparent. It's written for a faculty audience, and it's a piece of the U of R's academic honesty website that has live links connecting to different parts of the university's 24-page, that's right, I'll say it again, 24-page academic honesty policy. This kind of flowchart, I think, becomes especially important when we remember that Pecorari's definition of flexibility boils down to essentially whether faculty or any other stakeholder feels that understanding the process and navigating it has been worth time and effort. Further, I'll comment that the level of detail in this flowchart and in the U of R policy in general, to the extent that it helps faculty feel more comfortable explaining the policy to students, it opens up communication, and particularly this can benefit multilingual students for whom issues of academic honesty tend to be intimidating and taboo, and so leads to further surprises. Okay, so even so, for many institutional policies, processes, and in general, the discourse around academic honesty, flexibility is always going to be the sticking point. And what's essentially an unknown and unguaranteeable, if it's confusing to faculty, tends to be doubly confusing to students, and then by extension, extra doubly confusing to multilingual students. So what can we as their advocates do about that? We can empathize and help our colleagues find ways to empathize as closely as possible with the magnitude of the challenges multilingual students are up against in pursuing their degrees here in the States or in another English medium institution. So really, really briefly, this is an excerpt from David Bartholomew's Inventing the University, which with the help of Google Translate, I've put 95% into Welsh. And that's to replicate what we know from literacy research about the threshold of lexical understanding needing to be at 95 to 98% of the items in a chunk of text in order for a reader to be able to process and write in a detailed and appropriate way from that piece of text. As a further follow-up, when I use this in faculty development work, I talk about a 2001 study by Miguel Roy, who found that even faculty who know a lot of individual lexical items within a piece of text can struggle to paraphrase it appropriately when that text comes from outside of their area of expertise. So for instance, physicists may struggle to paraphrase text from biology, humanists in general may struggle more to paraphrase from the work of social scientists, et cetera, et cetera. So finding ways to help faculty and administrators not just see, but experience this struggle can really go a long way toward motivating them to enact more socially just policies and processes, and really to make their assumptions as explicit as possible to multilingual students. We can go ahead and jump. Great, so next, borrowing again from Pecorari, any kind of reflective questions that can help create environments of empathy and compassion can lead us closer to that ideal of social justice. So these are questions that get at everything from the hidden assumptions of academic and professional genres and expectations to how faculty then translate those expectations to their students and how they make explicit for them some of what those disconnects are. So let's go on. And then finally, I'm going to talk with you really quickly about kind of a list of sound bites and talking points that I try to work into conversation whenever I'm communicating with colleagues across campus, be they faculty, staff, ideally when they're administrators, if I can target those of them who have some amount of power or control or influence over the academic honesty policy or how the process works in practice, that's always great. So talking about retention and fairness and equity, asking what we can know or credibly assume about multilingual students' understanding of academic honesty before they enrolled at our institutions and what we can expect of them afterwards. Being able to write from sources, pointing out that being able to write from sources and avoid plagiarism involves both knowing how, which is procedural knowledge, in addition to just knowing that. Very often with academic honesty, multilingual students know that it's important, know that it's wrong to plagiarize, but don't know how always to avoid doing so. Plagiarism is developmental. This is a point made out of the work of Rebecca Moore Howard. I've got a couple of her pieces cited below. I'm happy to share more resources on that. She's found in working with Tricia Service and Tanya Rodrigue that very often all students across the board tend to write from sources or from sentences, pardon me, rather than sources when they cite sources, which is to say they may cherry pick particular parts of source material and struggle to represent well the entirety of someone else's work. And then as those reflective questions that I shared on the previous slide from Pekarari make clear to us, examining the differences between academic and professional expectation around the integration and the use of sources without boiling things down to too simplistic terms. For instance, hanging too heavily on the cultural backgrounds of East Asian students and what we know or what we think we know, what the sort of popular perception is about reverence for the work of others and reverence to text. So the need to reproduce it verbatim when in American context, again, a very simplified, standardized, boiled down, really inaccurate view might say, oh, well, that's, it's part of their culture to honor sources, which, those of us who know more about that know is nonsense. So on the one hand, while Bourdieu and Passeron's observation is true that academic discourse isn't anyone's first language, and that's important to keep in mind, Matsuda and Jablonski also have it right in that if we equate the struggles multilingual students face with the struggles of learning to write in disciplinary contexts, then there's literally no language left to explain how multilingual students who are trying to do both things at once are facing exponentially more difficult challenges. So lastly, really important to keep in mind, and if I say nothing else to colleagues, I try to say this, language differences don't add to, they multiply the magnitude of the challenges multilingual students face in learning to write with and from sources in new disciplines and new contexts. So while there are no magic bullets here, if we keep the messaging consistent and we rely on what we know, we can do what we can to push the needle and make campus processes more transparent and fair and just for multilingual learners. Thank you.
Thank you all, and I apologize for the technical difficulty. I seem to keep losing the control over my slide for some reason, and apologize to everyone, including the presenters. We have our resources available on our website. If you Google Second Language Writing Standing Group on, or if you find us on Facebook, you are able to get more information or materials or upcoming events at our Second Language Writing Standing Group. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me or Nora, particularly at unjung.lee@qc.cuny.edu for any other concern. Now I will open up the question or comments for our workshop.
So, Unjung, can I just jump in here? This is Jennifer Slinkard. We had a question from Dominic Tracy in the comments. He asked the question why we chose to analyze rubrics instead of the assignment prompt themselves, which they thought might be easier to obtain for students. So yeah, I think that's a really great question, and you most certainly could have your students analyze assignment prompts. For our activity, we chose to analyze the rubrics because we thought that it was it's the assessment practices especially that reinforce language norms of correctness, or language norms and correctness. So we do, when we're working with this assignment, we ask students to look at the rubric in relation to the assignment. So if they have access to the rubric, which hopefully they do, or they can ask for the grading criteria for their work, then they can analyze them in conjunction with the actual assignment, as well as things that have been taught in class. Oftentimes we find that language like grammar, mechanics might be included on a rubric when it's not actually taught in the classroom. So we like to ask students if they think that it is appropriate for instructors to assess them on things that they haven't been taught in that class. Then we have opportunity to talk about assumptions of where students come from, monolingual norms, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, thanks for your question. Let us know if you have any follow-up questions.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, and also the question and your answer. Is there any other question?
I can go ahead with the next question. So Robin's asking if presenters recommend training a core group of writing center tutors with more intensive training and work with multilingual students, or separate units for multilingual students. There are different ways to go about this, but in professional development for multilingual students, for tutors, we've definitely held sessions that are specifically about working with multilingual students, but we're also keen in other more general sessions to bring in multilingual students' needs, questions, and expectations to confirm the belief that they are part and parcel of our student population, and that any student that comes into the Writing Center may not disclose that they're multilingual, and that you should be well equipped with these resources. I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but I'm happy to open it up to other folks as well.
I would like to say something in response to that. I think it's a really important question. At City College of New York, where I'm Missy Watson, and that's where I work, and so many of the students, a majority of the students are multilingual, and so that helps me think about how this question is really context dependent. Like, I think it would be a shame if at City College all of our Writing Center tutors weren't ready and equipped to work with multilingual students. And there's something nice about having a center that's for everyone, rather than kind of containing multilingualism and putting it somewhere else, a problem for like a select few to kind of worry about. So I do think it depends, but there is something I think really valuable in making sure this is an issue that everyone is tackling, rather than something to separate.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say really quickly, kind of what you're observing, Missy, that there's a balance to be struck between having some people who have deep specialty. I'm thinking particularly about the academic honesty process, both on the pedagogy and the kind of the policy side, of the importance of having people that can be pointed to while sharing the responsibility out, because it can so easily become just a thing that a few people do, or some of us do. And that's important to avoid.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other question? I think we have time for just one more question, perhaps.
So I see that Missy actually asked a question in the chat board earlier about plagiarism policies that might relate to Pecorari's framework, but also describe rights and protections for students. And in my experience, those are few and far between. The U of R actually has a really robust 24-page policy, and it goes a long way towards making students aware of what their rights and their protections are in the process. The role that I hold is also key to making those rights and protections clear to students, in that I interface with students at many points of the academic honesty process, from general kind of prevention and education to the moment of reporting. Folks across campus will send them to me to review the policy and to talk about what their options are. Now, regarding multilingual students, the policy here at U of R, while it's robust, I think it's fair to say wasn't written by multilingual specialists. And so in the weeks that I've been here, I'm relatively new to this position, it's been, I've been very sensitive to learning about times and situations where that fact might trip up multilingual students. And certainly it's very, very high on my list of professional goals here.
Thank you so much. I see one more question, but I think we're out of time. So
I'd say go ahead and answer, because I think it's not a particularly long question, and it's actually a really good one to make sure we're all clear on. So Yatunde is asking, struggling with the term multilingual students, are we talking about multilingual international students new to the American educational system?
I think Nora and Jennifer, you can answer this question very well.
I can address part of this question. This is Nora. So multilingual, the way Jennifer and I and others have perceived it as well, is it encompasses, yes, of course, it encompasses international students, but it also encompasses local students, domestic students who grew up in the US and may be speaking their home language exclusively at home with their family, and then very, easily transferring to English in the class. I'd love others to jump in because, you know, the terms and labels are quite intricate when we talk about them.
Yeah, I'll speak just briefly because I've been really embracing the term because it doesn't put a label on somebody as being learning or proficient or not very good at any particular language. And my experience in California schools was that a lot of kids were classified as English as a second language, and yet to them, they spoke English better than they spoke any other language. So multilingual, to me, really celebrates the fact that they have more than one language, and maybe developing skills in one or another of those languages, but it's not a clear, you're not from here, and therefore will give you a label that says you're foreign or different.
And I'm just going to add one more thing to that, Betsy. This is Jennifer Slinkard. And I like the term multilingual, but I think in our assignments anyway, we're also considering students as multidialectal because there are different varieties of English, especially in that assignment about language attitudes. We have students listen to accents especially, and so that might be because they're multilingual, or it might be because of regional dialect, or something else like that. So yes, we include those like multi-dialects. If you take a translingual stance, then we're not trying to separate them out as separate languages. That's it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
good point. Yeah, and it also helps highlight the fact that just about everybody speaks more than one variety of a language, and that kind of comes back to the discussion of monolingual ideologies and helping students understand that there is no standard that everybody should aspire to. So, okay, I think that was our last question, and so with that, we need to conclude our program. Today's presentation was by speakers from the Conference on College Composition and Communication Second Language Writing Standing Group, titled A More Just Campus for Multilingual Students. Thank you very much to all of our presenters. And do go to the URL for their group, secondlanguagewriting.wordpress.com, and check out the materials they've shared. Each one of them gave a much longer workshop at the 4Cs conference. So these are quick little summaries of what they've done. So check all that out. And if you're from TESOL and are not aware that we also have a second language writing interest section, please join us. We do a lot of things during the year, including a book club and these webinars, and we have a lovely newsletter and very active discussions on both Facebook and on my TESOL. So please get involved, get active. We would love to hear more from you. Thank you very much, and I think you can disconnect from this webinar now.